The soldiers on the French border smoked their cigarettes in silence, watching the fog drift over the countryside. Spring had arrived early in 1940. Green fields stretched out in every direction, flowers bloomed, birds sang, and war, for a moment, felt like something distant, theoretical. The real battle, everyone assumed, was months away. If it came at all. Behind them stood the Great Wall of France's pride, the Maginot Line, an unbreakable line of steel and concrete bunkers, tunnels, and artillery emplacements, stretching for hundreds of kilometers along the German frontier. The French had poured billions into it. They believed it would hold. It had to. The trauma of World War I was still fresh. No one wanted another meat grinder of trenches and gas and senseless slaughter. This time, they were ready. This time, they had learned. Or so they thought. Across the border, hidden in forests and hills, the German war machine was already awake. Tanks were being fueled. Troops briefed. Radios crackled in the early morning dark. Adolf Hitler, the man dismissed as a lunatic just years earlier, was preparing to roll the dice again. And this time, he wasn't planning to fight the last war. He was planning to rewrite the way war worked. On May 10, 1940, the silence shattered. German bombers roared across the sky before dawn, their engines screaming over Belgium and the Netherlands. Paratroopers dropped onto key bridges and airfields. Meanwhile, panzer divisions, fast, heavily armored, and ruthless, tore across the borders in multiple directions, splitting enemy lines before anyone fully understood what was happening. The Allied High Command reacted as expected. Believing the Germans were repeating their World War I strategy, French and British troops rushed north into Belgium to confront the enemy head-on. But it was a trap. The real strike was coming somewhere else. The Germans had chosen to move their main force through the Ardennes forest, a thick, hilly region in southern Belgium and northern France. It was considered impassable for tanks. That's exactly why France hadn't defended it properly. But Hitler's generals knew better. They sent over 130,000 vehicles, tanks, trucks, motorcycles, and fuel carriers through that very terrain. Within days, German armor had punched a massive hole in the Allied lines. By the time the French realized what had happened, it was already too late. The speed was unlike anything the world had seen before. This was blitzkrieg lightning war, a strategy of overwhelming force and momentum. Don't stop. Don't give the enemy time to regroup. Break their communication. Surround them. Move faster than they can think. And it worked. Cities fell one after the other: Sedan, Boulogne, Calais. Radio operators were overwhelmed, outposts cut off, generals operating with maps that were already outdated by the hour. Allied forces in Belgium were suddenly isolated. The Germans had raced around them and reached the coast. The British Expeditionary Force, BEF, along with hundreds of thousands of French and Belgian troops, were now trapped in a shrinking pocket, backed up against the sea. One British officer later recalled, "We had prepared for a slow war. What we got was a hurricane." Meanwhile, civilians were caught in the middle. Refugees by the millions fled south. Horse carts, bicycles, baby carriages, anything that could move was used to carry families away from the front. German bombers strafed columns of civilians without mercy. Cities burned. Roads were jammed. Children cried. No one knew where safety was. The French government was in shock. Their army, once thought to be the strongest in Europe, was folding under the pressure. Their defenses were obsolete, their generals confused, their strategy from another century. As chaos spread, one word kept whispering through military channels, through towns: through the very soul of the country. Dunkirk. The port town on the northern coast, near the Belgian border, suddenly became the only way out. If the British and French troops could reach Dunkirk, they might escape. If they were caught before then, the war would be over. The race for Dunkirk began. British and French forces fought tooth and nail in a desperate retreat, trying to hold back the Germans just long enough. There were moments of fierce resistance. The stand at Arras, where a small British tank force briefly stunned the Germans, or the battles around Lille, where French troops refused to surrender and bought crucial time. But the pressure was too much. By May 25, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were cornered in and around Dunkirk. The beaches stretched out before them wide, flat, and fully exposed to German aircraft. The harbor was bombed. The town was burning. They had no food, little ammunition, and almost no chance. Back in London, Churchill made the call. Operation Dynamo would begin. The goal: evacuate as many men as possible, even though military leaders doubted they could save more than 30,000. The Royal Navy began scrambling ships. Destroyers, minesweepers, transport vessels. But they weren't enough. So the people of Britain were called to act. Across the Channel, the civilian boats began to gather: small fishing trawlers, ferries, pleasure yachts, sailboats, hundreds of them. They would become known as the little ships of Dunkirk. No one had ordered them. They came because they had to. Because their sons, their brothers, their friends were stranded on those beaches. Because the line between civilians and soldiers no longer mattered. On the beaches, the soldiers waited. Lines formed in the sand, stretching into the sea. They stood for hours, sometimes days, under the constant roar of bombs. They watched their comrades die. They buried the dead in shallow graves. And still, they waited for a miracle. That miracle was just beginning. As Chapter 1 ends, the sky above Dunkirk is dark with smoke. German guns rumble in the distance. The tide washes over broken helmets and shattered rifles. And in the distance, faint and growing louder, the sound of engines on the water. Help is coming. The sky above northern France had turned to smoke and steel. German dive bombers, their sirens howling like banshees, fell from the sky with surgical precision, striking roads, columns of soldiers, and convoys of desperate civilians. Beneath them, what was left of the Allied armies were choking on dust, smoke, and disbelief. France was collapsing, not slowly, not in weeks or months, but in a matter of days. And no one in charge seemed to understand how. The speed of the German invasion had caught the entire world off guard. The Blitzkrieg wasn't just a tactic, it was a revolution. Tanks moved faster than strategy could adapt. Radios relayed decisions before generals had time to gather their thoughts. Entire units were bypassed, encircled, and annihilated before they even knew the battle had begun. France had built its defenses on the memory of World War I, but the Germans were fighting the next war. By the end of May 1940, the situation had turned desperate. Nearly 400,000 British and French soldiers had been pushed back into a thin strip of land between the advancing German forces and the cold waters of the English Channel. All roads led to Dunkirk, a small port town now choked with soldiers, smoke, and uncertainty. The beaches were packed with troops, stranded in the open like targets on a rifle range. Most had no shelter, no food, and no orders except, wait. But wait for what? The Luftwaffe flew constant sorties overhead, bombing ships, dropping leaflets promising safe surrender, turning the flat beaches into death traps. Soldiers buried their heads in the sand as bombs whistled down. Others tried to dig trenches in the dunes with their helmets, desperate for any kind of protection. The sea, their only hope of escape, was calm, too calm. And too far. The harbor at Dunkirk had been destroyed by German bombing. Large ships couldn't get close to the beach. Soldiers had to wade out, sometimes shoulder-deep in freezing water, to reach boats waiting offshore. Every second in that water was a gamble. A direct hit could send dozens to their deaths in seconds. But then came the miracle no one expected. Back in Britain, the Royal Navy had begun the impossible, Operation Dynamo. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, operating from a secret war room deep beneath Dover Castle, oversaw the rescue effort. The goal was simple: get as many men home as possible, though few believed it would be more than 30,000 or 40,000. But the Royal Navy's destroyers were too few. Many had already been sunk or damaged. And so, Ramsay made a desperate call, one that would change the course of history. He called on the civilian fleet. The British people responded. From the harbors of Ramsgate, Margate, and Dover, hundreds of small boats set sail: fishing trawlers, pleasure yachts, lifeboats, paddle steamers. Some were crewed by Royal Navy personnel, others by civilians, ordinary men and women who had never seen combat, now volunteering to sail into a war zone. They became known as the little ships of Dunkirk, and they would become legends. One by one, they began arriving at Dunkirk. Weaving between mines and burning ships, dodging bombs and bullets, they picked up soldiers from the shallows, from wrecks, from sinking boats. Some made dozens of trips in a single day, ferrying men from the beach to larger ships waiting offshore. Others were sunk mid-crossing, their crews either killed or pulled aboard by others. For the soldiers on the beach, the sight of these boats was almost unbelievable. Is this it? Some whispered. A small wooden fishing boat, bouncing in the surf, suddenly meant life. Survival. Home. There were no seats. No cover. Just men packed shoulder to shoulder, praying the next dive bomber would miss. The Germans continued their assault. The Luftwaffe turned the sky into fire. Columns of smoke rose from the port, from burning tankers, from fuel depots. Yet the rescue did not stop. Even as the tide of war pushed against them, the Allied resolve held. French soldiers, too, were part of the miracle, holding the perimeter, fighting desperate rearguard actions to buy the British time to evacuate. Many knew they would never be rescued. They fought anyway. In Lille, nearly 40,000 French troops delayed German advances for several days, sacrificing themselves so that thousands more could escape. And then, against all odds, the numbers began to rise. 30,000 rescued. Then 80,000. Then 150,000. By June 2, over 300,000 soldiers had been pulled from the beaches. French, British, and Belgian troops, dirty, starved, wounded, exhausted, arrived on English soil to crowds, tears, and silence. Many were ashamed. They had left their equipment, their comrades, even their country behind. Some feared Britain would think of them as cowards. But they weren't met with judgment. They were met with relief. Winston Churchill, addressing the House of Commons, called it what it was, a miracle of deliverance. But he also delivered a warning. Dunkirk was not a victory. It was an escape. Wars are not won by evacuations, he reminded the nation. France, meanwhile, was crumbling. The Germans were closing in on Paris. The French government had begun to fracture, some pushing for continued resistance, others calling for surrender. But that story was not yet finished. For now, Dunkirk stood as something more than a battle or a rescue. It became a symbol of defiance, of unity, of courage under fire. The little boats, the calm soldiers on the beach, the civilians who risked everything, they reminded the world that even in retreat, there could be dignity. Even in chaos, there could be courage. As the last boats departed, smoke trailing behind them, the beaches fell silent. The war would rage on. Greater horrors still lay ahead. But at Dunkirk, the Allies had held the line not with strength, but with will. And that will would carry them through what was to come. The sea had become a graveyard. Broken hulls drifted in the tide. Oil slicks shimmered on the water like blood beneath moonlight. And yet, from the smoke, the boats kept coming. By early June 1940, the beaches of Dunkirk looked like the edge of the world. For nearly 10 days, men had been evacuated almost non-stop by destroyers, by merchant ships, by tiny fishing boats barely large enough to carry 10 passengers. The operation had already rescued hundreds of thousands. But thousands still remained. And now, time was up. The German army was closing in fast. From the south, panzers roared toward Dunkirk like wolves circling a bleeding animal. The sky was thick with Luftwaffe aircraft, and the smoke of burning fuel depots choked the air. The beaches that had once been filled with lines of soldiers were now pockmarked with craters, abandoned gear, and the shattered remains of boats. And yet, for the men left behind, the waiting continued. On the British side, the last of the soldiers were being pulled out. But not all were allowed to go. The French First Army, along with other exhausted units, had been ordered to stay behind and fight to the last to hold the perimeter while the final boats left. They knew what it meant. They were being sacrificed. In the town of Lille, nearly 40,000 French soldiers, outgunned and outflanked, dug in. Their commanders knew the orders were impossible, but they obeyed. They fought with bayonets and Molotov cocktails when the ammunition ran out. They mounted desperate counterattacks against German tanks. They covered streets with rubble and turned buildings into makeshift bunkers. For 5 days, they held off superior German forces. It was madness. It was bravery. It was war. Their stand delayed the Germans just long enough. Thanks to their sacrifice, an additional 100,000 Allied troops escaped through Dunkirk in the final days of evacuation. And yet, few of those French soldiers ever returned home. Most were either killed in battle or captured and sent to POW camps. Their names were not broadcast over radios. They weren't met with cheers or headlines. But without them, the beaches would have become a slaughterhouse. On June 4, 1940, Operation Dynamo officially ended. The final boat, HMS Shikari, left Dunkirk just before dawn, her decks packed with French soldiers and wounded British officers. She was under heavy fire as she pulled away, bullets skipping across the water like stones, bombs falling in the distance, flames flickering behind the smoke. She made it out. In total, over 338,000 Allied troops had been rescued from the beaches, a number no one had believed possible. Over 700 vessels had taken part, including more than 200 civilian boats. It was a logistical miracle, pulled off in chaos, under fire, against all odds. But it came at a terrible price. The Allies left behind almost 2,500 artillery pieces, 65,000 vehicles, and hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunition and supplies. It was the largest military withdrawal in history, a triumph of survival, but also a brutal admission of defeat. And France, now exposed and half-empty of defenders, was bleeding. In the days following Dunkirk, the German advance continued with frightening speed. The French government, already fractured and uncertain, fled Paris on June 10. Ministers, clerks, and generals piled into cars and trains, heading south to Bordeaux. The streets of Paris were quiet. No last stand. No resistance. Only fear. 4 days later, On June 14, 1940, German troops entered the city. They marched down the Champs-Élysées beneath towering Nazi flags. The Eiffel Tower, once a symbol of beauty and freedom, stood over occupied soil. Hitler didn't even have to fight for it. The French army had been broken, its leadership in shambles. What was once considered one of the most powerful nations on earth had been defeated in just 6 weeks. The news sent shockwaves around the world. In Britain, the mood shifted overnight. Just days earlier, newspapers had called Dunkirk a miracle. But now, there was no denying the truth: Britain stood alone. Every ally on the continent had fallen. The German war machine now stretched from the North Sea to the Pyrenees. If Hitler turned his eyes across the Channel, there was little standing in his way. But still, Churchill refused to blink. Speaking before Parliament, on June 4, the very day the last boat left Dunkirk, he delivered one of his most famous speeches. His voice, heavy with defiance, rang through the radio waves. "We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." For the men who returned from Dunkirk, the speech felt like a shield, something to hold onto when the nightmares came. Many of them were sent straight back into service. There was no time to recover. The war was just beginning. For the French, however, the nightmare deepened. On June 22, less than 3 weeks after Dunkirk, the French government signed an armistice with Nazi Germany. The northern half of France would be occupied. The southern half would be governed by a puppet regime known as Vichy France, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, the same man who had been a hero in World War I. Now, he had surrendered his country without a final fight. The signing took place in the very same railway carriage where Germany had signed its own surrender at the end of World War I in 1918, a final insult orchestrated by Hitler himself. France, humiliated and divided, went quiet. But not everyone accepted the surrender. In London, a relatively unknown French general named Charles de Gaulle refused to recognize the Vichy regime. On June 18, he gave a broadcast on the BBC, calling on the French people to resist. He would go on to lead the Free French forces, fighting from exile, a flicker of hope that France had not entirely given in. The miracle of Dunkirk had ended, but the story of the war was far from over. In the weeks that followed, Britain braced for invasion. Pilots prepared for the coming battle in the skies. Children were evacuated from cities. Sandbags filled the windows of Parliament. The war had entered a new phase, one that would be fought not in retreat, but in defiance. And in the minds of every man who had stood on that beach in Dunkirk, one truth had become unshakable. This war would not be quick. It would not be easy. But it could still be won.
दोस्तों ये लड़का हर दिन रोड के बीच में